protections that we are all legally entitled to. And the best advice I can give to you is to see a tax consultant, be that an attorney or an accountant or a CPA. We would thank you for watching Legally Speaking, and the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys is proud to present this program. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Averita Hanson. Welcome to Legally Speaking. This is the weekly public interest television series brought to you by the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys. Today our topic is automobile law and safety. We're quite fortunate to have with us Joyce Kennard. Attorney Kennard is a lawyer and consultant on the areas of defective cars and consumer rights. She lives here with us in Atlanta. She's a graduate of the University of Michigan, Wayne State University Law School. She was a staff attorney for the Center of Auto Safety in Washington, D.C. She's quite an expert on the subject. She was the co-author of The Lemon Book in 1980 with Ralph Nader and Clarence Ditlow. She is also the author of the Magnuson-Moss Litigation Manual, which is laws that affect this area of automobile safety. Well, welcome to Legally Speaking. We're happy to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. We have lots of questions. You know, many of us drive cars. We have to get around Atlanta and the state of Georgia and around the country. And we're all interested in our safety driving cars and in our rights in buying cars. Let me start off with asking you that if I bought a new car, for instance, and 2 days later that car wouldn't go any faster than 30 miles an hour, what could I do? Could I get my money back?
There is a possibility you can, and you should always remember that you might be able to, so it keeps you going. You got to be persistent. First of all, you do want to give the dealer and manufacturer a chance to fix your car. Okay. Then...
Now, you mentioned the dealer or manufacturer. Would you explain to us what's the difference between the two?
You go to the dealership and allow the dealer service personnel to fix your car. If the dealer fails to fix it properly, then you go to the manufacturer. You can make an appointment to see the manufacturer's representative, who usually travels within a zone area and usually goes to each dealership about once a month. If the dealer cannot fix your car, if all the personnel there have failed to do it, then you can see this manufacturer's representative. Sometimes they have ways of getting things done, and they either recognize the problem, say, aha, I've seen this in another state, or else they just go ahead and push it through, and they'll get it done for you.
Of course, we know how to find the dealer because that's where we bought the car. But how do we find the manufacturer's representative?
Most of the time, you can make an appointment through the dealership. You just very nicely say, I'm sorry, it looks like we're not getting anything accomplished, to the service representative at the dealership, the person who writes the orders or the person in charge of the service department, and say, I would like to make an appointment with the manufacturer's representative the next time he or she is in town. Can you help me out? Now, if for some reason they don't help you, most of the time they do, most of the time they'll give you a phone number to contact that person, and you set up the appointment with the person the next time he or she is in town. And if for some reason they just don't help you at all and say, I'm sorry, you know, we don't even know who this person is, then you go through the manufacturer and you call the consumer relations department at the manufacturer's main office, or else you go into the information that came with the car. You usually have some kind of written information, a warranty booklet, or some other kind of a booklet that came with that car. Usually there is a warranty booklet, and there is some other material that will explain, have phone numbers, what to do if you need help.
Okay, good. Say, for instance, if you don't buy a new car, you buy a used car, what rights do you have if the used car turns out to be a lemon?
Well, it depends, first of all, when you bought that used car, whether... Okay, let me back up a minute. There is a Federal Trade Commission rule that requires a buyer's guide to be placed as a window sticker on the used car. This is assuming you buy it from a dealer and not a private party through a newspaper ad. Now, this buyer's guide is going to tell you whether the car is being sold as is or with a warranty.
What does as is mean?
As is means you, the consumer who buys the car, are responsible when the car needs repairs. So that means you foot the repair bill, not the dealer. Now, if on that buyer's guide that is a window sticker on the window of the car, if it's checked with a warranty, then the warranty has to tell you what they will fix, how much they will pay for it, and so forth and so on, and how long this warranty is going to last. Now, if it falls within the terms of the warranty, that means the dealer has to repair the car for X amount of dollars that is listed percentage-wise or whatever it is. If it falls outside of the warranty, you are stuck with the repair bill. Buying a used car saves you a lot of money up front. You don't have that depreciation, but you do take a risk when you buy a used car. Now, I can offer at this point one of the things to remember if you do buy a used car. We at the Center for Auto Safety, when I worked there, would always tell people the main thing to remember is to have it checked out, have the car checked out thoroughly by a mechanic that is independent of the seller that you're buying the car from. So if you go to Joe's dealership to look at the car, you don't have the mechanics at Joe's dealership check out the car.
Mm-hmm.
You go to someone else to check out the car, and then that tells you whether the car is in pretty decent shape. So you know something about that car.
Would it be useful to go to some of these places called diagnostic centers where they can put it on and run it through a computer and tell you what all the problems are?
If that diagnostic center has a good reputation, then that would be very useful.
Okay.
But you want to be sure that their reputation is good too. And there's a lot of things to check on a car when you have a thorough exam, and you should be prepared to spend. You can spend $100 checking out a car and then not buy the car.
Sure.
But this is a form of insurance.
Sure, and you should know what you're getting.
Absolutely.
You mentioned that you get a warranty, which of course is a written guarantee of what the seller will do for you should the car need repairs. You get this warranty usually when you buy a car through a car dealership. What about when you buy a car out of the newspaper, from a newspaper ad?
Yeah, unfortunately there's no warranty when you buy a car from a private party. In a very unusual type of circumstance, you might have a situation where you go buy a car from a private party out of a newspaper ad and say, I want you to put in writing that this car is guaranteed. The problem is you have to have a whole contract written out. You're going to have to say what is going to happen if such and such goes wrong, and whether you get your money back or what, and who pays for repairs. That's a possibility. I mean, you can contract with someone who sells you the car and protect yourself, but it's going to be a rare instance where you're going to find a seller out of the newspaper who's going to go through all that trouble of a contract, because that means you have to go to your lawyers, and so that's not a feasible thing that most people do.
Could you still ask to borrow the car and to maybe, I don't know, leave a deposit or take the seller with you and have it checked out?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I would say 2 things to do before you buy a used car. Before you buy any car, first thing is you always take it for a test drive. And the second thing, if it's a used car, then you do want to have it thoroughly checked out by a mechanic.
Okay. Would you tell us how a fairly standard warranty would work?
Well, a standard warranty tells you how long the warranty lasts, what parts in the car are covered by the warranty, and who pays for these repairs.
Okay. So when you buy a new car and you have a warranty, and the car has major problems during that warranty period, whether it's a year or 12,000 miles or whatever, and the dealer does not or can't fix the problems properly, what rights do you have if the warranty expires?
Okay, if the dealer simply can't fix the car, you still have rights even though the warranty has expired. In Georgia and in all the other states except Louisiana, there's something that exists called the Uniform Commercial Code. This is a state law that gives you certain remedies if the warranty fails. And in this case, if the dealer and the manufacturer cannot fix the car and it's during the warranty period, then in a sense the warranty has failed and the Uniform Commercial Code kicks in. And one of the strategies that exists under the Uniform Commercial Code, which is also called the UCC, is called revocation of acceptance. This is something that you might have heard of. It means giving the car back to the dealer and then expecting a refund of the purchase price. Now, this is not an automatic thing. It sometimes takes legal action, but it is a right that exists under the state law, under the Uniform Commercial Code. One thing to remember, if you ever do revoke acceptance on a car, I would strongly suggest consulting with a lawyer because there are technicalities in the law that have to be followed,
Right.
or you do not properly revoke
Right.
acceptance.
And I imagine that's not an easy thing to do because we talked about when you buy a new car, you buy a lot of depreciation. I've heard that when you drive it off the lot, it depreciates at least $600.
Right.
So I imagine that most dealers do not want to take the car back.
That's right. But in your question before, when you were saying what happens if it's 30 miles an hour, the car goes 30 miles an hour,
Right.
and you just purchased that car, and the dealer is given a reasonable opportunity to fix the car, and you're stuck with a brand new car that won't go over 30
Right.
miles an hour, revocation of acceptance can be very effective in a case like this.
Wouldn't that be something that you would have to do fairly soon after the car fails and the warranty fails?
That's correct. Most of the time you want to do it within the warranty period if you have a major defect that cannot be corrected. And if the warranty has expired, and you're talking usually after about a year or so, then you want to do it real soon. You don't want to wait a long time.
Okay. What if the major problems, I think you may have addressed this though, showed up right after the warranty expired?
Right after the warranty expired. Now this is a little different than, first we had the dealer trying to fix the car during the warranty period,
Okay.
could not fix it. Your warranty expires and they say, sorry, your warranty expired, what can we do for you? And then I was saying you still have rights under the Uniform Commercial Code. Your warranty has failed in that case. It has not fixed your car. Your warranty said that your car was going to be fixed. It has failed. Now in a case where the defects arise after the warranty expires, we're not talking about a failure of warranty. We're talking about latent defects. This is also covered by the Uniform Commercial Code. There is a section called the Implied Warranty of Merchantability. This means that a car or other consumer products, including cars, have to be merchantable. And the way merchantable is defined means that a car has to run like a car. It can't run like a toy truck. It has to be something you get in and turn the key and it starts.
Right.
And takes you from point A to point B. So if the car is not merchantable, if you can argue this, if there's a latent defect which arises after the warranty expires, you can still go through the same procedures under the Uniform Commercial Code, which protects you in these cases. And this is something that, these are legal rights that often have to be exercised with the help of a lawyer. But I don't want to sound like that's the only way to go. There are other strategies besides using lawyers.
Okay, well, we'll talk about some of those.
Okay.
How can anyone afford to sue a large car company if everything else fails and the lawsuit is the only thing that they have to resort to? Aren't they big? Don't they have big, expensive lawyers up against you? What do you do?
It can be very expensive. We are lucky that there is a law, it's a federal law, called the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act. It's been around since 1975, but it's just now catching on. People are just finding out about it. There is a provision which is known as the attorney's fees provision in that law, which allows the court to award your attorney's fees and the cost of bringing suit to be paid by the other side if you should win. That means, for example, if you sue General Motors and you're suing for $10,000, you want a refund of your purchase price. Your attorney is going to probably charge at least $7,000 to bring the case. It's going to be very expensive, like you imagined.
Sure.
What does that leave you? You win $10,000, you pay attorney $7,000, that leaves you with $3,000. Well, you probably could have sold your car for more than that and not had to go through the hassle of a lawsuit. Well, what the attorney's fees provision does is it allows the court, or the judge, we're talking about the judge, to tell GM, say, GM, look, you pay this consumer that $7,000 attorney fee. So the attorney gets paid by General Motors, the $10,000 you're awarded, you keep.
Sure.
And it's an excellent provision. I hope every attorney knows about this provision if you ever file a suit.
Can these Magnuson Moss cases be brought in state court, or must they be brought in federal court?
They definitely can be brought in state court. It is a federal law, and it allows the consumer to sue, and we're talking about cars here now, the dealer or the manufacturer in state court or federal court. Most cases will be brought in state court.
Okay. If you don't want to hire a lawyer, is there some court in Georgia that you can go to where you can represent yourself and have a fighting chance?
Yes. This is something called what's known as the magistrate court. A lot of people will know it as a small claims court. Technically in Georgia, the court system, it's called a magistrate's court. In this court, you can file the claim yourself. You don't need a lawyer. The problem is you can file up to $2,500.
Right.
So if you're looking to get a refund on a car, the $2,500 isn't going to go very far. It will help you if you buy a used car for, say, $2,500, $3,000. Excuse me. It's going to help you, because if you spend even $3,500 for a used car and you get back $2,500, you're still getting back a substantial amount.
Right.
But for a new car, the only time it's going to help you is when you're talking about you have your brake fixed somewhere and they don't do a good job, and you want to get back what you paid that repair facility to have your brakes fixed.
Sure.
You can get back. We're talking about those kinds of instances, repairs and things like that.
I understand with more people keeping their cars longer that there are more places now that do repairs than we used to have before. They're not just your corner service stations or your dealers that are doing repairs. So I imagine there are many good repair people out there, but sometimes we have disputes, and that the magistrate's court is a good place to take them. I understand that cars are much more complicated than many of us can understand. We don't always know what the problems are, although there may be problems and we can't get them fixed. In proving our cases, wherever we have to prove it, in whatever court or forum, I imagine that we need experts. Is it, do you have to go and get an independent expert to look at your car, or can you rely on some of the things that the experts say, and the dealers or the manufacturers that they say? What can you do? Because I understand when you bring a lawsuit, you have to pay experts, and this can make your cost of bringing the suit a lot higher.
Well, in many cases, you do have to pay an expert to come look at the car and write up a report and then come to trial and testify, and it does bring up the cost of the lawsuit. And as I was saying, in the attorney's fees provision under the Magnuson Moss Act, that's a very vital provision. If you ever bring a lawsuit, you have to use that provision, because your costs are going to go up. And there are cases where you do get something written down for free, where somebody just, some independent mechanic just writes it down for you and it's not going to charge you. And then he might even come and testify at your trial.
And does that attorney's fee provision take into account experts' fees?
Yes. That would be considered under the cost of bringing suit. Yes, it would.
Okay. There are laws in some states that are basically called lemon laws. Lemons are, of course, cars that we get that just don't do what they're supposed to do. Is there a lemon law in Georgia?
Unfortunately, there is no lemon law in Georgia, as we are talking about lemon laws. There are other laws which I will tell you about.
Sure.
There have been bills that have been introduced in Georgia. We're trying to get a lemon law in Georgia, but right now There is no law. And
Well, are there any government agencies that you can go to help you if you have a defective car?
Yes, particularly with a safety defect. In Washington, D.C., there is a federal government agency called the United States Department of Transportation, and under that is called the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, also known as NHTSA. NHTSA, I prefer to call it NHTSA.
Okay.
It's less easier to say. Now, NHTSA has an Office of Defects Investigation. And if you have a safety defect with your car, they're going to want to know about it. There's a toll-free number that you can call to tell them, or else you can write them a letter. Now, NHTSA, what they have to do is they have to investigate safety defects that are reported to them. And this may lead to a recall of all the affected cars with that problem. It's nice to know that many times consumer complaints have triggered a recall of a car.
What's a recall?
Now, a recall is where you have a safety problem with your car. You may or may not know about it. You get a letter from the manufacturer, first-class mail, that says that this problem exists. They notify you that you have the problem, and they notify you where you should take your car to have it fixed.
Okay.
Recall means all the cars that have the problem should be taken back to the dealer by the individual owners and fixed at no charge.
Okay. If you have a lemon car, can you stop making the payments on it while you're trying to get your case resolved or while you're trying to get it fixed?
This is something many people want to do. And believe it or not, there is a rule in the federal government that allows you to do this. This is the Federal Trade Commission so-called holder in due course rule. That's the name that it's used most frequently. This means that you can stop making payments in certain circumstances. The problem is, like revocation of acceptance, there are certain technicalities that have to be followed. If you do it on your own, it's very difficult for it to stand up in court.
Right.
You probably have to use a lawyer to get a consultation on how to follow all the rules in the holder in due course rule. And it can get pretty complicated, but it's something you do as a last resort if you want to stop making payments.
Okay. Can you join in with other people in a class action against a, say, manufacturer or something? And how are you eligible to join a class that may have a lawsuit against a car manufacturer?
A class action is a very valuable tool. This is where a group of individuals band together, and it's the old strength in numbers.
Sure.
And it's true. They save money because they share the legal costs and the attorney's fees. They usually have the same complaint. Okay, first of all, they're going to have the same kind of car,
right,
the same make and model. It may be a couple of different years that it spans, but it's going to be the same make and model generally, same
right,
manufacturer. The complaint is usually the same, although there may be a range of complaints, between 1 and 5 different problems, all within this class action. It's a very valuable tool, and it's something that consumers ought to look into if you do have a problem with your car.
How do you find out about it?
Okay, one place you can check is with the Center for Auto Safety in Washington, D.C. The center is a nonprofit consumer group founded in 1970 by Ralph Nader and Consumers Union, and their main priorities are to make cars more reliable for consumers and to make the laws stronger, such as instituting these lemon laws.
Great.
They will try to put you in touch with some other owners to see, first of all, whether a class action already exists.
Right.
And if it doesn't exist, they can help you meet other people that have the same car with the same problem.
So that's the Center for Auto Safety.
The Center for Auto Safety in Washington, D.C.
What new laws would you suggest that we need here in Georgia to protect automobile owners?
Oh, the first one is, like you mentioned, the lemon law.
Okay.
That would be a very helpful and useful law to have. Specifically, what the lemon law does is it defines precisely when a car is defective enough where you can get the remedy, and it's a nice remedy. You can get a refund of your purchase price, that's your money back, or you get a replacement car.
That's wonderful.
And that's what we need. And
yeah,
there are 35 other states that have these laws.
Wow. What is a service contract, and do most people need them?
A service contract is something that you're usually offered when you buy a new or used car through a dealer. This is a form of insurance. It's just like any other insurance. You can get by without it, but it's nice if you have it. What it does is if your warranty expires and there's a major repair bill and you're going to be out a lot of money, Then if you have a service contract, that'll usually pay for the repair. If you don't, you usually pay for the repair. Now I want to mention that technically speaking, under state law, as we said, if your warranty has just expired and you have a major repair,
Right.
technically the manufacturer should be liable for that repair.
Sure.
But it means a lot of trouble and a lot of effort to get that repair paid for. In some cases, not in all cases.
Okay. Is there anything that you can do to avoid buying a lemon car, new or used?
Okay? Whether it is a new or used car, you must take that car for a test drive.
Okay.
And if a dealer will not let you test that car, or if you're buying from a private party and he or she won't let you drive that car before you buy it, walk away, go somewhere else.
Okay.
It's essential to get in that car, get the feel of the car, take it for a test drive, see how it stops when you come to a light, just your everyday driving experience. Take it on the freeway if you're a freeway driver, and get a feel for what you're buying. A lot of
Right.
times people find out in that test drive that there's something major wrong with that car.
Sure.
Like the car that wouldn't go over 30 miles an hour.
Sure.
You can find that out in a test drive.
Okay. But that's driving the actual car that you're going to buy.
Yes.
Are there things that we can do to research the cars for their reliability records? I understand that's quite good when you're buying a
Yes,
used car.
definitely. I would recommend a magazine called Consumer Reports, which has an April issue. The April issue of every year, they list the frequency of repair bills, and they also examine many different makes and models of car for reliability and repairs.
Don't they also have a buyer's guide that comes out in December or January?
Yes, December.
That also covers used car records?
That's right.
Okay.
That's a useful tool. And they also have another publication specifically about buying a used car.
Beautiful. I think a lot of our viewers would be interested in that. At this time, I'd just like to stop and say thank you for appearing on Legally Speaking. I'd like to tell the audience something about our organization that brings you this show today. The Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys started in 1981 essentially as women advocating for women. We represent the interest of over 200 black female judges, lawyers, consultants, entrepreneurs, professors, politicians, elected officials, and students throughout the state of Georgia. We operate our programs through several committees: community action, community legal education, interbar relations, political action, judicial legal positions, law student relations, just a wide variety of activities, much like this program, Legally Speaking, which is part of our community legal education program. I would like to just end in asking Attorney Kennard just some general questions about auto safety. What is your opinion about wearing a seatbelt, for instance?
I think seat belts save lives and they protect against injuries, and I think they're a good idea to wear. It's like a state trooper said once, I've never had to unbuckle a dead person.
All right. And what about the use of child restraint seats?
Absolutely. Many people tragically are unaware that if you hold a baby in your lap while you're in a car, you stand a chance of crushing that child or that baby if you're thrown against your dashboard.
Sure.
And this is something that no matter how strong you are not going to be able to stop. I would say under all circumstances, put your children in seat belts and in baby and child car seats every time you go out in the car.
And you should put yourself in the seat belt too.
Yes,
You know,
definitely.
I think the case of Barbara Mandrell certainly made that evident that that was a lifesaver to her
Yes.
and her family.
Yes.
Again, I thank you, Attorney Joyce Kennard, for appearing with us on the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys show, Legally Speaking.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Legally Speaking. My name is Averita Hanson, and I'm a lawyer here in Atlanta. Today our topic is voting rights, especially in the state of Georgia, and we're fortunate to have with us today Attorney Paula Bonds. Attorney Bonds is a graduate of Spelman College here in Atlanta. She received her first law degree from the Northwestern University in Chicago. She received a master's in law from the University of Wisconsin. There, she did her thesis, her study, on a comparative analysis of voting rights in the North and the South. So we're very pleased to have with us an expert today in the area of voting rights. Welcome.
Thank you.
She's presently a staff attorney for the American Civil Liberties Union regional office here in Atlanta. And we'd like to have her talk to us about voting rights in general, and again, voting rights in the state of Georgia today. Would you just begin with telling us what laws or what statutes can people use to protect their right to vote?
There are two primary provisions that are used in voting rights cases. The first is the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and the second is a relatively recently passed piece of legislation, Section 2, the amended Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
Okay, could we go back to the 14th Amendment? Now, that was one of the Civil War amendments, right?
That's correct.
Okay,
yes.
and you talked about the Equal Protection Clause. Would you explain that for our viewers?
Well, the Equal Protection Clause requires us to examine the extent to which two different groups are treated equally or treated differently. And of course, the provision itself states that two groups cannot be discriminated against by race. And so we bring the case because we're arguing, in essence, in all of these cases, that black people are being discriminated against on the basis of race, and so it's applicable.
Okay, does this just apply to black people, or does it take into account some of the other types of discrimination, ethnic origin, or religion?
When you're talking about voting rights, you do have the language-speaking minorities that come under that, and that includes Hispanics and also various Indian groups, and in some cases Asian minorities on the West Coast.
Okay.
But you don't have religious minorities coming under the provisions.
So it's not the broad-based discrimination.
That's correct.
We're really talking about national origin, race, or language minorities.
Right.
Okay. You mentioned some fairly recent legislation, the Voting Rights Act. You were talking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965?
Yes, but it's been recently amended.
Okay, when was that?
That was done in 1982.
Okay.
And the reason for the amendment was that the courts had interpreted the Equal Protection Clause as requiring purpose in order to prove discrimination. And of course, as purposes is always more difficult to prove than effects.
That's a very high standard, that you have to prove that, you have to jump into somebody's mind. Are you talking about that? And,
yes.
And say that it was their purpose to discriminate against black people or language-speaking minorities.
Exactly. And even now, to the extent that one brings a case exclusively under the Equal Protection Clause, you would still have to prove that.
Okay.
But Section 2 provides an alternative whereby you can just show that there are discriminatory results, and you don't have to look into the motivations of the legislators, which is a much simpler standard of proof. And the civil rights community went to lobby specifically for that in order to ease the burden.
So I assume that there's a whole lot of things that you look at for determining whether your voting rights have been denied or diluted. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So would you go ahead and tell us, how would you prove a voting rights case? Why don't you give us an example of a typical voting rights case, and then tell us how you would prove it, either in purpose or effects.
All right. One of the most prevalent concerns in the state of Georgia and throughout the South is the at-large election system.
And what is that?
The extent to which, well, the at-large election system is a system whereby people are appointed, or rather elected, either to a city commission or to a county commission. It can be either body. But they're elected by the electorate as a whole, which means that, for example, if you have a county of 1,000 people, and 600 of those people are white and 400 are black, and you are able to elect 3 or 4 representatives, then in each instance that 6,000 can control, even though the 4,000 is a substantial percentage of the population.
I see. So basically it's a majority vote and the majority can control.
Exactly.
And the minority never really gets a fair shot at being representative if in fact people vote along racial lines.
And that is one of the factors that the courts look at. Generally speaking, the courts are going to be looking in those cases at the extent to which blacks have an equal opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. Now that gets us into some things that you sort of alluded to just a moment ago, and the first is that you oftentimes cannot elect a black person under that system. But in those situations where you can, then the kind of black candidate that you have to offer has to appeal more across the board.
I see.
And may not be as representative of the black community as you would like, so that you have a compromise in terms of the offering up of the candidate, because a candidate who might be more straightforward or more aggressive or assertive may not be appealing to both the black and white communities, and you would need that crossover. The courts look at several factors in order to determine whether the blacks have that equal opportunity, or language minorities have that equal opportunity, and one of them, as you just pointed out, is racially polarized voting. And I think that that is really, under the amended Section 2, the primary factor the courts do take a look at.
That people vote along racial lines, that you don't have much crossover voting.
That's right.
Okay.
Because again, your focus is on race being the reason why blacks cannot be elected. There may be all kinds of reasons, theoretically, why a candidate does not get elected. And the court is, or the law is not really concerned with the full array of those. It's just concerned with the extent to which it focuses on race.
Okay, what are some of the other factors that the courts look at?
The courts also take a look at the extent to which there's been a history of discrimination in the jurisdiction. That, again, is something that is less pivotal under the result standard than it was under the purpose standard, but it is still a factor.
Could you give us an example of that?
Well, if you have, throughout the South, as a matter of fact, you have had a history of literacy tests and
like poll taxes,
various mechanisms that have been designed expressly to keep blacks from voting, because traditionally in the South you have large numbers of blacks, and you had to have devices that operated across the board in order to effectively preclude, in many instances, as much as 30 or 40% of the entire electorate from, or the potential electorate, from registering to vote.
When you say electorate, what do you mean?
I mean those persons who are eligible to actually cast a ballot.
Okay, that they are United States citizens, they are 18 years old or older.
That's right. Or a resident of whatever political subdivision you're talking about.
Okay. What are some of the other factors that the courts looked at? You just told us racially polarized voting and history of discrimination.
That's right. The courts look at the extent to which there have been blacks elected to the particular at-large system. So to the extent that blacks have not been successful, then of course that would suggest at least some preliminary evidence of a failure to open the system up equally to blacks. So that's another factor that the courts focus on in those things. There are also a series of what the court calls secondary factors, the majority vote requirement and other things which tend to enhance.
And what is majority vote requirement?
Well, the majority vote requirement requires that if a candidate has less than 50% of the vote, ultimately that he or she will have to go into a runoff with the person who received the second highest number of votes.
Okay.
And that's a problem existing in the South and especially in Georgia, and it operates in many instances to preclude blacks from being elected. A good example is the Harold Washington election in Chicago. Had there been a majority vote requirement, then presumably Jane Byrne and Mayor Daley's son would have been in a runoff, and Harold Washington would not have gotten.
Well, what was the percent of the vote that he got?
Approximately a three-way split.
I
between
see,
those
but he
three.
got the highest of the three.
That's
and
right.
And because he was not required to win by a majority, he won.
Exactly.
I see. I see. Are there any other secondary factors that you'd like to talk about?
Yes, the courts look at the size of the districts as well as, well, the size is important because presumably the larger the district is, the more difficult it is to campaign throughout the district.
Right.
So those kinds of things, and the extent to which there may be residency requirements, so that even though you don't have to vote for a person who lives in your particular district, people are required to offer up for a particular place on the ballot, which means that you can control the tendency in some places for candidates to live all on the same street, for example. If you have a residency requirement, then you divide the jurisdiction up, and you've got to have a representative from each area, which in some ways, at least, enhances the possibility that a black person might be elected given housing segregation patterns.
Okay.
That's something else the courts look to.
Okay. Is there any other thing that you'd like to mention that courts look at?
I think those are the primary things.
Well, what happens when you bring a voting rights case? Are you claiming that your vote has either been diluted or denied? What can you get from this?
Well, what you get, it depends on the challenge that you're bringing. If you're bringing an at-large election system challenge, then the result that you would want generally would be single-member districts.
And what's that?
That means that you divide the jurisdiction up in such a way that people have to run from areas that they live in, and not only that, that people who live in those areas get to vote on the particular person from their jurisdiction. Rather than having the entire city vote on you, you vote on your own representative, and that of course enhances the opportunity of blacks to be elected, given again the housing segregation patterns.
Right.
Then the division is such that blacks would in large part be able to have more of a say without that compromising factor involved.
Okay. Well, what other kinds of remedies can you get from a voting rights case besides the single-member district?
All right. Well, it depends on the kind of case that you're bringing. Some other problems that we have in the state of Georgia and have historically had in the voter dilution area include such things as annexation and consolidation.
And would you take one of those at a time and tell us what they are?
All right. Annexation is an effort usually by a city to enlarge its boundaries by incorporating surrounding areas. But those areas are generally areas short of incorporating the entire county, which is consolidation.
I see. And that is used to bring in more people to dilute black voters' strength.
Right. You're bringing in specifically in most of those instances more white people, so that the percentages are less. And this is a tactic that's been used not only in the context of an at-large election system, but it can also be used where you have changed to a single-member district for a city, for example, which is has turned majority black, and you then have a majority of people represented on the city council. And the other people in the county may become concerned about that and may seek to gain control again, and there's no other way really to do that aside from bringing in other people, which then makes you a minority.
Do you think that that's what would happen if Atlanta and Fulton County consolidate?
Well, I think that clearly that's the concern that people have, and it's a legitimate concern because it is a practice which has traditionally been used to dilute the black vote. And of course, the situation that I just described does characterize Atlanta and Fulton County.
Even though Atlanta has has a combination of single-member districts as well as at-large elections.
Right.
I assume just with the sheer numbers is that the voter strength could be diluted with the consolidation.
That's right. The concern when you're talking about consolidation or annexation is who has the balance of power on the board.
Okay.
You're talking about an at-large election system. Generally, you're asking whether blacks have any representation or sufficient representation.
I see.
But when you get into that area, you're talking about who has the majority, who's ruling.
I see. I see. I get the idea that these voting rights cases are somewhat larger than most of us. Of course, we're one person, one vote country. And I just wonder who can afford to bring these kind of cases. They must be expensive. You're going up against either a county or a city. Why don't you tell us who are the kind of plaintiffs, the people who are going to bring these kind of lawsuits?
All right. Generally, you have NAACP branches or other civic organizations or civil rights groups that are organized in the various localities who become concerned and get together and decide that they want to bring a suit, and they may either approach an organization such as ours, the ACLU, or approach a private attorney to handle that case. The problem is, as you pointed out, the expense. In addition to that, it's protracted litigation over several years in some instances, and of course there are expenses because generally you're traveling to that location, and it does get to be quite overwhelming if one thinks about having to pay it out of pocket. But what happens as a practical matter in these cases is that either private attorneys will take the case or an organization will take the case, and as a result of the civil rights attorneys' fees provisions, then when the plaintiffs win, assuming of course that they do, then it is up to the defendants to pay for the suit, and that ends up being quite a good factor to have as leverage when you're negotiating the cases.
Okay. Could you talk about some of the cases that you have been involved in or know about in the state of Georgia?
Yes. The biggest problem in the state of Georgia, the largest number of suits are brought involving single-member districts, and there are countless numbers of counties and cities that we have sued in recent years or in the process of suing or being approached to sue. It is getting to be almost an epidemic of sorts in those places where that has not taken place. In South Georgia, especially, and in Southeast Georgia, Southwest Georgia. Of course, the northern part of Georgia, there are fewer blacks residing there, so you don't have as much activity in that respect. In terms of the annexation and consolidations that we were talking about, there's discussion, as you mentioned, for the future, perhaps the distant future, but the future nonetheless as far as Fulton County is concerned. And it's also an issue in the area of Brunswick and Glenn County, and also Macon and Bibb County have discussed the issue, and Milledgeville has discussed the issue. So again, wherever I think we can predict that wherever we begin to see majority black either county commissions or cities, that we be talking in terms of that as a possible way of diluting the black vote.
Sure. I think that's happened within the last 10 years in Metro Atlanta. People may not be aware that the city of College Park was involved in a voting rights case involving a possibility of annexation to dilute the black voting strength, and also was under an order by the Justice Department to reapportion the population to give blacks some single-member districts where they had an opportunity to elect a black elected official. One thing I would like to ask you is, what happens after you win these cases? And there should be an opportunity, because of a majority black population, to elect officials. Why aren't some of us doing that?
Well, that gets us into another factor which I didn't go into, which is sort of related to the history of voting discrimination that I was talking about, and that is the socioeconomic disparities between blacks and whites that courts look at. Those things, coupled with the history of voter discrimination, lead in large part to voter apathy. And the courts are willing to assume, as they look at voter turnout figures and at voter registration figures, most of the times black voter registration and turnout figures are much lower than those of the other community. And in part, at least, the courts have been willing to say that this is a result of the history of discrimination and the intimidation that blacks have suffered and still do continue to suffer.
You know, to what extent is there intimidation and harassment of black voters and potential voters?
That exists in large part even now. Those are more isolated kinds of cases, and it's more difficult to really address those than it is to address the larger structural problems, and it tends to be more of a piecemeal kind of thing in individual communities.
Well, are we going through more subtle types of intimidation, like a system that allows an incumbent to name all of the people who work at the polls, and then they don't particularly want to help black voters or be fair to black voters? Is that a more subtle form of intimidation or harassment?
That's right. That's one example. Another example would be to ask people whether they have ever been arrested when they come in to vote, or whether they have ever been convicted of a crime without distinguishing crimes of moral turpitude and other kinds of things that relate to voter registration requirements.
Right.
And of course, that kind of question, which is irrelevant, and of course the person who goes in to register doesn't know that that's not a valid question.
And the person who's asking it doesn't have the authority usually to do anything about it, to change their registration, do they?
I'm sorry.
The people who ask the question don't have any authority over that person to not allow them to vote, but a lot of times they don't know that.
That's right.
Okay.
The person who's going in does not realize that.
Right.
And again, if one is feeling powerlessness, and the political scientists tell us that one's lack of economic achievement and educational background and all of those kinds of things do impact upon one's sense of powerfulness and ability to really impact on the world around him or her. And voting is a way of doing that.
Right, to understand that their vote really can count.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm just going to take a break right now while I've got Attorney Bonds here, and tell the audience something about the organization that sponsors this show. The Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys was founded in 1981 primarily as women advocating for women. Today it represents over 200 black female judges, lawyers, entrepreneurs, elected officials, law professors, law students, etc. throughout the state of Georgia. It's very interested in voting rights and other issues directly affecting black people throughout the state of Georgia. And our programs are operated through several committees, including community action, community legal education, interbar relations, judicial legal positions, law student relations, and political action. So we invite the viewers to contact us in care of this station if there's any information in the law that we can help them with. I think this show shows the commitment of educating the community, and certainly the issues that we've been talking about today in the area of voting rights are extremely effective. We've talked about the issue of power and powerlessness, and I think it's been discussed within the last few years that perhaps black people need to be more responsible for our own destiny, and that our vote really can make a difference. Would you tell us some of the success stories that you're familiar with, some of the cases where we've gone to single-member districting or otherwise impacted upon a city or county commission, and black people have felt that their lives have really been improved by their by their involvement in the political process?
There are numerous examples. One especially that comes to mind is in Edgefield, South Carolina, where the county commission was sued, and there was a change to the single-member district, and now there is a black chairman of the county commission and several other black members as well. And the impact of that is that black people are able to impact upon the decisions that are made. They feel that there's someone there who can respond and who will respond to their particular needs, and for so long oftentimes they have been overlooked and denied, so that it represents a wonderful opportunity, and also hopefully in the future will increase our sense of powerfulness,
Right.
so that we will go out and take advantage of this wonderful opportunity.
That's right. One area I'd like you to touch on before we close today is the area of absentee voting. I understand that there was a voting rights case in Burke County, Georgia, involving absentee voters, and we find that in some of the more rural and suburban counties that absentee voting, of course, is used more as people are not able to physically get to the polls. And it should be there, it should be our right to use an absentee ballot, but we find that black voters either don't understand the process or don't use absentee voting as much as other voters do, and how absentee voting can be abused to dilute or deny blacks a right to vote. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that is again one of the tactics that has been used historically as blacks have become more empowered politically, to see to it that blacks don't become elected. And there was an article, a series of articles that were published in the Atlanta Journal and Constitution at the time the Voting Rights Act amendment was coming up, and they talked in detail about several instances across the state and across the South where this has taken place. And I might add as well that there have been trials going on over the last 6 months or so in the state of Alabama and in the Black Belt, where the Attorney General has targeted black people who have helped other blacks use the absentee ballot
Right.
effectively. And so it not only is something that has been used against us in the past, but it's being used against us in
Right
an
now.
offensive way.
Right.
Yeah.
Before we close, would you just very briefly tell the audience how they can contact you or the other attorneys at the American Civil Liberties Union if they have some more interest in bringing a voting rights case or about voting rights in general?
Yes, certainly. We're located at 52 Fairley Street, Suite 355 here in Atlanta, and the number is area code 404-523-2721, and we'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
Okay, so that's 523.
2721.
All right. Thank you, Attorney Bonds, for being with us today on Legally Speaking to discuss voting rights around the country and especially here in Georgia. I think our viewers share my enthusiasm that our vote really can count and we should be involved in the political process.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you again. topic of our show is AIDS. We are lucky to have with us Dr. William Alexander and State Representative Billy McKinney. Welcome.
Thank you.
How you doing? Dr. Alexander is a graduate of Harvard University, the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. He's board certified in internal medicine, and he is subspecializing in infectious diseases here in Atlanta. State Representative McKinney represents the 35th District in Northwest Atlanta. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'd like to talk today about both the medical aspects of the disease AIDS and the public health aspects, which Representative McKinney has been very active in this session of the legislature. Dr. Alexander, would you start with telling us what is AIDS?
Well, AIDS, or the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, is not a disease but a group of diseases that has been described in the last 5 years affecting certain parts of the population. It is due to an infection with a virus called the HTLV-3 virus. HTLV-3 stands for human T-cell lymphotrophic virus. This virus infects one of the cells of the immune system that's very important in helping your body fight off infections. And because of this infection with this virus, people at high risk get a variety of illnesses caused by diseases that would not affect people with a normal immune system. Since AIDS was first described in 1981, there have been about 16,000 cases reported in the United States. 60% are whites, 25% are blacks, and 14% are Hispanic. 93% of the patients with AIDS are men. The people who are at risk for AIDS, many people are aware of this, are bisexual or homosexual males, who make up about 70% of all the AIDS cases. People who are intravenous drug abusers, they make up about 15 to 17%
What's
of
that,
cases.
like people who shoot up
People
heroin
who shoot
or,
up heroin, cocaine, speed, and combinations thereof.
Okay.
And then the rest is made up of people who have been exposed to infected blood products, either blood itself or other blood products, by blood transfusions or by factor concentrate infusions in patients who have hemophilia. And finally, there's a small group of people who have developed AIDS from heterosexual contact with patients at high risk for infection with the HTLV-3 virus. And finally, there are children that make up a small percent who, in general, are born to women who are infected with the virus and have AIDS or an AIDS-like condition.
Okay, you mentioned that you started taking the statistics in 1981. Is this a new disease? Or group of diseases?
It probably is a new disease, although it's been around for more than the last 7 years. It's interesting, there have been some studies in other parts of the world, in fact, studies done in the 60s, in which sera from patients from 18, 20 years ago has been tested for the virus, and the virus has been found in other parts of the world. But in general, in terms of the epidemic, it's been here for the last 7 to 8 years.
Okay. How do you get AIDS?
Well, again, based on the people who are at risk, there are only a few ways of getting the virus, infected with the virus. And that's intimate contact, sexual contact, intimate contact with people at risk. Again, the vast majority of patients who developed AIDS have been gay or bisexual men. By intravenous drug abuse or exposure to blood or blood products infected with the virus, and by getting blood transfusions. They have been the main routes, and we have focused more on heterosexual spread of the virus in the last year or so, and again in children. The children who have been infected with the virus are infected usually at the time of delivery, and again their mothers are usually infected with the virus and have AIDS or AIDS-like condition.
Okay. You mentioned about children at time of delivery. Is there any way of delivering, perhaps, to get around being infected?
This is an area that's being studied more and more now. It's not clear whether or not cesarean section would decrease the chance of transmission of the virus to the children at the time of delivery. The basic CDC recommendation now is that if a woman knows that she is infected with the virus and has either AIDS or an AIDS-like condition, that she should refrain from getting pregnant because the chance of the child getting AIDS is so high.
You mentioned the CDC. What is that?
Center of Disease Control that's based here in Atlanta.
Okay. Could you tell us how you can test for AIDS, whether you have the infection or are a carrier of the infection?
Right. In the past 2 years, the virus that is the cause of AIDS has been identified, and work done at the National Institutes of Health under the direction of Dr. Robert Gallo, and at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, France, under the direction of Dr. Montagnier, have identified the virus and developed blood tests looking to measure antibodies that your body makes against the virus. And so that we have a test that can measure antibodies to the HTLV3 virus. And that's been very helpful, not so much in terms of making the diagnosis of AIDS, which is before the test had been a clinical diagnosis, patients in the risk groups that I mentioned that develop unusual infections, but in people who are exposed to people at high risk to let them know if they are indeed infected. What you have to remember is that a lot of people have been infected with the virus. It is speculated that at least 1 million Americans have been infected with the HTLV3 virus.
Right.
Out of that 1 million, there are people who have no symptoms and who are well. There are patients who have swollen lymph glands that we call AIDS-related complex and other related illnesses, and then there are patients who have AIDS, who have unusual infections such as pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, such as an unusual cancer called Kaposi sarcoma, disseminated candida or yeast infection, and other opportunistic infections that don't occur in normal people. So there's a spectrum in terms of the manifestations and symptoms of the infection.
Okay, and it'd be good for people to know about this so that if they don't know, they can go and get tested to make sure whether or not they are a carrier. And talking about testing, is there something like a false positive test or a false negative test? I don't want to alarm our viewers if they do go and get tested, but in any other kind of testing procedure, isn't there some times that it can be wrong?
Right. I mean, this test is not 100%.
Okay.
And any test has a certain rate of false positive and false negative test. In addition, it depends on what population you study. If you look at people who are at higher risk for getting infected with the virus, bisexual, homosexual men, IV, intravenous drug abusers as the 2 prime examples, then in that setting, when you do the test, you have a greater chance of having a true positive test.
Okay.
But when you move to populations that are not at high risk for infection with this virus, then the chance of having a false positive test increases. And our society is now trying to deal with the ramifications of infection with this virus in terms of employment, in terms of insurability, etc. And so that until things are worked out a little better, it could be potentially catastrophic if somebody who is not at risk for HTLV infection had a false positive test.
Right. Well, that's the interest that Representative Billy McKinney has had in bringing some new or amended public health legislation in the area of AIDS. We'd like you to talk about the legislation that you have recently introduced and which has passed the House, I believe. Has it been enacted yet totally, or just explain to us where it is now?
Well, it passed the House of Representatives day before yesterday, 167 to zip. I was very surprised because we were led to believe that it was going to be a highly controversial piece of legislation. The only controversy about it was raised by the high-risk group that the doctor has talked about, and that is the homosexual community. My involvement in the issue of AIDS came because my wife has been head nurse at Grady Emergency Clinic for 32 years. And she told me that they had no policy at Grady Hospital. I started checking into it in order to help the employees who were afraid at Grady, and found that the state had no policy. They had created an AIDS task force composed of citizens, but the problem with that task force was they put too many homosexuals on the task force, which was in effect the fox looking out for the hen house. But the bill that I introduced simply said that AIDS would be a venereal disease, that is syphilis, gonorrhea, chancroids, and then add AIDS to it.
Okay, that was an old law that related to
1918 law
venereal diseases.
that was passed when syphilis was an epidemic of syphilis in 1918 when the American soldiers came back from Europe, and syphilis at that time was there was no cure for syphilis, so they had to isolate and quarantine people with syphilis. Well, the gay community came out in arms against AIDS being added to the list of venereal diseases because they said that in the rural sections of Georgia and possibly here in Atlanta, prosecutors and district attorneys and solicitors would harass them and isolate them, and that's what the doctor was talking about the false positive.
Right.
But what we finally passed was a bill that changed the name from venereal disease to sexually transmitted diseases.
Okay.
And all of the powers that were in the 1918 law is still there.
And what are those?
Well,
do they include doctors reporting?
Doctors must report. It's a misdemeanor if they don't report it.
Report what, though? Specifically what? That the person has
AIDS.
Tested?
No. They must report AIDS. They must report AIDS cases that they treat to the Department of Public Health. Now, that was a policy but not law. I wanted it in the law so that there would be no question about it. In Gwinnett County, you might remember that a school teacher died and the doctor put on the death certificate pneumonia, but it was AIDS. When the funeral directors were up in arms because they treated and pulled the blood and the body fluids out of this person,
right,
not knowing that it was an AIDS patient. The parents in the school were up in arms because their children had been taught by this person and they didn't know it. So it's a 100% mortality rated disease. There is no cure
at this time.
And everybody that gets it dies within 2 years, within 18 months or 2 years. It's a terrible disease that we cannot put our heads in the sand and say it's not here, and that's what the gay community wanted to do.
Okay.
Reverend Ken South came to the General Assembly daily and was more interested in protecting the gay community's advances in civil rights than they were in saving their own lives. And my only interest in this bill was safety for the heterosexual community, and that's the whole community.
Right.
And safety for the homosexual community. They wanted some money for an outpatient clinic at Grady Hospital. We gave them money for an 18-hour clinic. It should have been for 24 hours, but it was cut back to 18 hours. They wanted money for education and counseling, and I think that's very important that we have. You've got to counsel these people because, and you've got to treat the side illnesses, but they must be counseled.
What about public health education for AIDS statewide, though? You know, I think a lot of us, because we don't know about the disease, we don't know the facts that we're talking about here today. It's like the undertakers, the funeral parlors, the school children issues, those of us who may come into contact with, no matter what our own lifestyle is, with people who are carriers. What's being done in that area?
Well, the point is that in the state of Georgia, there are 272 cases of AIDS. All of them are in Atlanta or in Fulton County, except one down in South. There's one case of AIDS in the 17 southern counties of the state. There's one case in the northern section of the state and one just around Macon. So what we have is a problem because we have a large homosexual community here, we have to deal with it where it is. My problem in trying to pass the legislation is that nobody wanted to talk about it.
Okay.
How can you educate people
Right.
when you don't want to talk about it? And when the doctor says high-risk sexual practices, nobody wants to talk about what we're talking about when we say high-risk sexual practices.
Right.
But the doctor will tell you that we're talking about anal sex. We're talking about semen. Women can't get it other than a man has to give it to her because she doesn't have any semen.
Well, he also mentioned there are other ways, IV drug abusers and blood products, but there's such a...
IV drug abusers got it from a gay person or a bisexual person. The woman who is an IV drug abuser, she got it from a person who... See, when you say a disease is sexually transmitted, it is sexually transmitted now.
That's true.
It's not, you ain't gonna get it sitting on a toilet stool
Right.
or whatever. You're gonna get it sexually transmitted. Women and two homosexual women cannot transmit the disease to each other because they don't have any semen.
Right.
Men have semen.
Yeah, but the virus is, right, that's true. The virus has been found, though, in other body fluids, tears, saliva, and so that although it has not been well described, there still is that potential for spread with other body fluids. It is very unusual for a man to get AIDS from a woman, although it has been described, and it's not clear whether the virus is actually secreted in vaginal secretions or not, but that is being studied at present. But you have to have intimate contact with somebody infected with the virus to be infected. And what's important to point out is that there have been, in several settings, looking at the family members of people who had AIDS, who have less than intimate contact, which includes kissing on the face, kissing on the mouth, using, sharing utensils, etc. There have been no cases of AIDS described in that setting, and which is encouraging. And so that, and getting back to the question about the concern of the public in terms of their exposure to people at risk, you really have to have intimate contact or be exposed to body secretions, and something must happen to make it easier for the virus to get into your system, such as if you have cuts or nicks on your hands, or if you've been exposed to secretions that might get in your eye or your mouth or something like that. So outside of that, it's very difficult to increase your chance of being infected with the virus.
Representative McKinney, what is the status of your legislation at this point? You said it passed the House. Where does it go from here?
Well, it goes to the Senate. Hopefully, it'll pass the Senate just as easily as it passed the House, and then it'll go to the governor for his signature. Basically, what the legislation does is it gives the Department of Public Health those tools that they need in order to deal with this deadly disease. They did not have them written into law.
Okay.
They do now have them. Well, they will have them once it passes the Senate and is signed by the governor.
Okay, and what are those tools? The doctors reporting, the testing of suspected cases, and what else?
Well, beyond that, pregnant women of the high-risk group can be forced to take a blood test.
All right. But it's not required for premarital testing or anything like that?
Not required for premarital test, but it's required when you get for pregnant women of a high-risk group.
Of a high-risk.
And that's at the discretion of the public health department. And I know that gives them some latitude to describe the high-risk group. But presently there are two high-risk groups, and that is, well, there are three really. Prostitutes, and that's intravenous drug abusers, and homosexuals. Those are the high-risk groups of people. So they can eventually force isolation and quarantine if it becomes necessary. The point is that here in Georgia, we don't have very many cases.
Okay.
In New York, the most cases in this country are in New York. Over 8,000 cases in New York.
Right.
And
California.
in San Francisco.
Right.
That's where we have allowed the gay community to just go at it. I have another bill, and that is to close up bathhouses where gay people go and have anonymous mass orgies, sex. And there's a case being litigated in court now. It went to the federal courts, and the federal courts kicked it back to the Fulton County Superior Court.
Okay.
And they were trying to close the one bathhouse that Mary Welcome left in Atlanta. You remember when Mary Welcome was closing up bathhouses?
Right.
Well, there was one left owned by the mafia out of New York, and they're trying to close that one up.
Okay.
And we
That's the Fulton County Solicitor's Office?
That's the Fulton County
It's trying to close this last bathhouse down.
Yeah.
Why don't we talk a little bit about something a little more positive, though? What is the status of the treatment for people who have the AIDS infection? And I have another question too: is people who are carriers, what happens to them?
Well, in terms of treatment of the infection with the virus, we do not have a cure yet. There are studies going on now looking at a variety of antiviral agents to try to kill the virus. And there are some preliminary reports to suggest that the variety of agents may be a benefit. But we are several years away from having a good idea of whether these antiviral agents work. There are other medicines that are being used that kind of stimulate the weakened immune system to make your body make more of these T helper cells that are very important in terms of what we call cell-mediated immunity, to fight off infections that these patients get. And again, one of the things that will happen because of the AIDS clinic at Grady, for example, will be to study some of these newer agents to see if they have any benefit. To answer the question about what happens to people who are infected with the virus, it's hard to know. As I mentioned before, as a guesstimate, maybe 1 million people are infected with the virus. Some people will be asymptomatic, have no problems. Some will clear the virus and not have any problems. And then some will go on to develop complications, such as swollen lymph glands all over the body, or full-blown AIDS at the end of the spectrum.
Okay.
If you look at the people that have the swollen glands, or what we call AIDS-related complex, then we have a good idea that maybe about 5 to 10% of them will go on to develop AIDS if they are sicker than people who just have swollen glands alone. If they have fever, if they've lost a lot of weight, if they have some other problems, yeast in the mouth, as an example, that they're at greater risk for going on to develop full-blown AIDS.
Okay.
So it's hard to answer that question in terms of knowing for sure.
Okay. I'm going to take a break right now and explain to our audience what the organization is that sponsors this show. The Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys was founded in 1981, essentially as women advocating for women. We operate our programs much like this show through several committees, including the Community Action, Community Legal Education, Interbar Relations, Political Action, Judicial and Legal Positions, and Law Student Relations. Today we represent over 200 black female judges, lawyers, elected officials, entrepreneurs, consultants, law students, etc. throughout the state of Georgia. We're interested in bringing to the Atlanta area public and eventually around the state of Georgia issues like this that we're discussing today, AIDS, especially as we who are involved in the law can make the law more responsive to our needs. I'd like to ask Representative McKinney to tell us before we close today how people can get involved in your legislative efforts, either pro or con, what can be done. We talked about the schedule that your bill, well, your two bills are going before the Senate, and how can people contact you and get involved in this?
Well, the whole thing about legislation is people should write to their legislators.
That's right.
They should call their legislators on the telephone. Phone number down there is 659-1100.
659-1100.
And leave a message that you're concerned about any kind of the legislation that you read about or that you know that we are dealing with. And the only way that we can force change, and that's what your organization is about, and I'm so happy that aside from making money and litigating as lawyers, that you are concerned about helping black people understand the political process and to understand the legal process and the judicial process.
It's very powerful.
Yes. It determines the quality of our lives. And write your legislators, call your legislators, come down to the Capitol
Come down.
and let them know.
That's right. Dr. Alexander, from a medical standpoint, could you tell people where to go for more information before we close today?
Well, for people who live in Fulton County, the Fulton County Health Department does provide testing for AIDS and counseling, and so that is a source for the test and for further information if you feel that you've been exposed to somebody at high risk. Hopefully your family physician would be another source of information concerning this epidemic.
Okay, and we mentioned the Grady Clinic.
Grady Clinic, and the Department of Public Health has set up 10 regional locations, and you could get them from the department by calling the Department of Public Health. They have set up 10 regional locations around the state for testing.
Okay.
Anonymous testing.
Okay.
And one of the problems that we had with the gay community was confidentiality.
That's right.
We have put that in the bill, and nobody's name will be discussed. It will not be released to anybody. There is complete confidentiality.
Well, that's great. I think our viewers would appreciate that. And anyone who suspects that they may have been exposed or who wants more information, we really encourage them to contact the sources that Representative McKinney and Dr. Alexander have given us today. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Alexander, a subspecialist in infectious disease.